Well, it is special today for me to get to speak on Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to the men in this congregation, and I think a lot about my dad, growing up with him as a pastor. This is doctorate from DTS, and how many hundreds of sermons did I hear throughout my life. It's like I stand on his shoulders today. Who would have thought that one day I would stand on the stage and get to share a sermon with my church on the same Sunday that he too is preaching up in Dallas. So it is an honor to be part of this preaching team this summer. So we're doing a series on the life of David, and it started out with Greg Grant, kicked it off looking through the life of David, giving highlights of how David's life is an example to us when we are willing to surrender, to be molded by the potter, to be transformed into the life that God has for us. And then a couple weeks ago, Laura Grant talked about the goodness of God, not just the goodness of God, but the gooderness of God, that God is gooder than anything else that we could ever desire in our lives, and that Satan is always trying to tempt us to distrust the goodness of God. So that lands me into my sermon today, and it's about the story with David and Bathsheba. Now, if I'm honest with you, I've often questioned this David, a man after God's own heart, and looking at the story of Bathsheba. It has seemed confusing to me that God has always called from the time before David was even born, knowing that he would be a man after God's own heart. And yet we have this story which seems really painful. It's like a paradox of the two. But as I've studied the story, I find that there is such treasure for us to learn from the story of David and Bathsheba. And I want to be careful in the story, 2 Samuel 11, 1 through 16. I'm going to summarize it here in a moment, but I want to be careful that we don't other David. We don't make him so different from us. You know, David killed a lion with his bare hands. He killed Goliath. He was the king of a nation that he seems so far removed from who we are today that we can't relate to who he is, because God has something in his life, and particularly in this story with David and Bathsheba, that he wants to teach us today. So just to summarize, story of David and Bathsheba, many of us are very familiar with it. David was on a rooftop one evening, and he's looking out, and he sees Bathsheba, a beautiful woman, and he's drawn to her, moment of temptation. He sends someone to go and inquire as to who she is. Pretty soon, Bathsheba was then called to David's palace. They sleep together. Bathsheba ends up getting pregnant. And I imagine David has some panic there, wanting to cover his sin. And so he calls her husband Uriah, who is a very prominent, diligent warrior in their army. He calls him off of the battlefield home, hoping that Uriah and Bathsheba will sleep together and it will cover up the sin that David had. However, when Uriah comes back, Uriah is such a man of integrity that he refuses to sleep with his wife. That is not what warriors do in a time of battle. David tried everything he could to get that to happen. Uriah still refused, slept outside the door. And so David then sent Uriah back into battle with instructions for Uriah to be placed on the front lines so that he would be killed. So what started with temptation led to sin, led to a cover-up, led to another cover-up, and eventually resulting in the murder of someone. And it seems, we have all these chapters of David's life where he's walking so intimately with God. And then in just a few short verses, we see his complete downfall and really into a pit of sin. So it's like 3 times David could have turned. At the moment of temptation, when he saw Bathsheba, he could have turned from his sin then, and he didn't. When Bathsheba was pregnant, he could have turned from his sin then, and he didn't. He tried to cover it up, even more with Uriah. He didn't turn to the Lord. And in looking at the passage, we're going to look at it today through a lens of shame. And I believe shame is what led David to cover up his sin into a place of isolation where he did not turn to the Lord. So to really talk about shame, we have to first look at what shame is and make a distinguishment between shame and guilt. Guilt is the anxiety or unhappiness that results from having done something wrong, something that's given to us from God. It's a good thing. Shame says, I did something bad. Guilt says, I did something bad. Now, shame, on the other hand, says, I am bad. We see a great example of guilt being used in a good way in David's life in the passage of 1 Samuel 24. Just to back up a little bit, Saul was hunting David down, wanting to kill him. David was with his men, and they came into a cave where Saul was sleeping. And David had this perfect opportunity when he could have killed Saul. Maybe he could have even justified killing him. He doesn't kill him. Instead, he slices off a piece of his robe. And it says, afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. So he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I would do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. And then later, David went out of the cave, and he called to Saul. He repented to Saul as well, asking for forgiveness and declaring that he would not lay a hand against Saul. So what we see here is David felt guilt about what he had done. He was immediately conscience-stricken, and then he turned towards his men to come clean, to ask for forgiveness, and to have restored relationship with them and a model of leadership. And then he goes out and seeks Saul to let Saul know also what he had done, and he's seeking reconnection there. So we see in this case where God uses guilt in a good way for David to have guilt, and guilt is being used to turn us to say, I'm sorry towards God and towards other people and seek reconnection and reconciliation. Shame, however, is really different from this. Shame does the opposite. We might feel guilt. Shame stands on the shoulders of guilt. But we feel shame, and then we move in the opposite direction towards isolation. So in shame, we're in isolation. We're alone with the thoughts in our head. We're not conversing with God or with other people to hear truth. So what are feelings of shame? I sent a poll out this week and asked several people, what are the first things that come to your mind when you hear the word shame? And these are some of the responses I heard back. Condemnation, feeling unlovable and broken, like butterflies in my stomach, like a pit with a sheet covering it. The worst thing, feeling mortified, one of my greatest enemies, humiliation. I would not be surprised if some of you are sitting in this room and just the word shame and seeing those words almost gives you like a physical sensation of shame. It's something that's like a felt sense that can physically take over our bodies when we feel shame. David missed multiple opportunities to turn his heart to the Lord. The shame led him to a place of isolation where I imagine he's feeling many of these things. And these aren't always just logical thoughts in our head. They're actually not. They're more of a felt sense. And I want to make a point here that in this case with David, we see that his sin led him to guilt, and then he moved towards his men. But guilt and shame shame does not always come out of a place of a feeling that overcomes us when we sin. I've been reading a book by Kurt Thompson called The Soul of Shame. I highly recommend it. It's an excellent book. And in this book, Kurt Thompson says, shame is the primary force that Satan uses against us to corrupt our relationships with God and with each other. And I think what's really important for us to understand, the enemy knows that if we believe in God's goodness, if we are constantly aware of his delight in us, if we're fully alive with the presence of God, we're going to do incredible things for the kingdom of God. So shame is really like these thoughts that are coming against us to make us disbelieve this, that God's deep, joyful pleasure is with us at all times, everywhere. Shame is the emotional weapon that Satan uses, and it attacks our identity, It attacks what we believe about the goodness of God, and it prevents us from flourishing in our gifts. And when we're flourishing in our gifts, we're creating space for other people to flourish as well. So shame is not just related to a sinful event. Shame is like an attendant. I think of those cartoons where you have like the little guy that's like telling somebody to do something bad. That's what shame is. It's like an attendant that's lurking in the background, infusing nonverbal and verbal judgments into our thoughts, really at any time of the day. Maybe it's in our cubicle at work, in the bedroom, in the car, in the classroom, at all times. Feelings of shame are these, like we talked about before, but they're really these ultra-thin slices of time where we have these small thoughts in the background that says, I'm not enough, there's something wrong with me, I don't matter, or I don't have what it takes to tolerate this moment or this circumstance. You can imagine that in getting ready for a sermon about shame, the amount of things in my life that have come up for me to feel shameful about. It has really been a battle. And especially as I've become aware of this second part, shame isn't just related to when we have sin in our lives, but it's those ultra-thin slices of time where we hear, not even necessarily being aware of these things that make us feel like we don't matter, or we don't have what it takes. I was thinking about shame a lot lately, and I was reflecting on an experience I had a few months ago at work where it became a very challenging situation relationally, and it felt like everything that I did wasn't working to resolve the problem. And I could apply this at work, it could be in relationships, it could be a work project, it's really anything. And the messier it got, the more I actually wanted to run the other direction, and honestly, I just wanted to quit. I don't even want to work anymore. I don't even want to do this. I don't even want to be in a relationship with this person anymore. And as I reflected on that in the context of shame, I realized there is some pieces of fear, and this is really hard, and we just don't want to have anything to do with it. But really, ultimately, what I was feeling in my heart was that I didn't really have what it took to resolve the relationship, the conflict in the relationship. I didn't have the wisdom that I needed to know how to go and seek reconciliation and solve the hurt that was going on. And so what was interesting to me is that shame wasn't famous at the time, right? Shame doesn't want to be famous. It wasn't right in my face, me thinking, oh, I feel shameful, and now I'm going to turn to God. No, shame is like a spy. We're the kids in here. Kids, shame is like a ninja spy lurking around in the dark corners. If shame was up in front center famous, then we might actually do something about it. But instead, it's just sly enough, infusing those elements of judgment, not so much that we notice them, but just enough to be bothersome to us. And so I believe that that's exactly what was happening with David. But it's important that we remember that God's deep, joyful pleasure is with us at all times, everywhere. When we believe this truth, that God created us to embody his presence and live in absolute joy from a place of being completely known, especially those parts where there's shame, that's why Jesus came. He came to reconcile us to a Father. And that's God's kingdom displayed here on earth. That's what we get to do as Jesus followers. We get to walk in the intimacy with God, believing this. Think about, like, if every circumstance that you encounter at work, with your kids, with your spouse, with your roommates in the classroom, if we're aware of God's pleasure over us, and I think there's one thing about God's love over us, and we hear that all the time. We should hear it all the time. But when you think about God's delight in us, I don't know about you, but that energizes me. It makes me want to stand up taller. It makes me really want to run for it and flourish in my gifts and say yes to God and really create space for other people to do the same thing. That's what we get. But with David, the shame led to isolation, and we don't see any interaction with God from the time Bathsheba eventually becomes one of his wives. They deliver their baby. And at that time, Nathan the prophet comes. And Nathan the prophet comes to deliver a word to David, a word of consequence. And I picture it like, here's David. He's had the whole thing with Bathsheba, covering up the sin, the murder. And I wonder what it was like for him in this place now to be alone in isolation, probably without a whole lot of interaction with God. And it's like his shame balloon grew bigger and bigger and bigger, or he completely lost maybe identity in who he was. And so Nathan the prophet comes. Here's David's shame balloon, and he pops it, right? He pops the shame balloon that had gotten so big, and David has an opportunity now. Now, you might think, if you're someone who all of us have been hiding in isolation, we're ashamed of what we have done, it feels mortifying for someone to find out. We don't want anyone to find out. But Nathan comes. He crosses over those borders and boundaries of isolation that David had, and he says, hey, come out of the darkness and into the light. This is David's response in Psalm 32, 3-4. He says, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. I think this is an incredible description of the physical sensation of shame, where it just completely saps us. But then David says, then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover up my iniquity, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. The shame was broken. The isolation was God. He turns to the Father, and we need people like Nathan in our lives. People like Nathan that are willing to cross through the isolation, come to us just like Nathan did with David, and say, hey, it's worth it. Reminding David who he is, reminding David who God is, and pulls him out of the isolation and into light. And when that happens, evil is given no oxygen to breathe. When shame is broken and we're residing in a place of connection and conversation with one another. Next, we see in Psalm 51, this is David's response, this psalm that he writes after he's turned back to the Lord. I love this psalm. Maybe many of us have read through this psalm when we desire reconnection with the Lord. Excuse me. Some of the verses in this psalm. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sin and blot out all my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. It's beautiful. This is God's truth to us. This is what he offers us. That last verse, the word create. The word create, the original word there is a Hebrew word called bara. We see this same word in Genesis 1:1, and it refers to an activity that can only be performed by God, and it describes entirely new productions. So just like in the beginning of creation, when God takes something out of nothing and creates this beautiful world, that's what God does with our hearts. Our hearts aren't, God's regeneration of our heart, it isn't like a chalkboard that's written on and then you erase it and it's gone, but you can still sort of see what was left behind, and then it gets written on again and you erase it again. And really in the end, it's there, but you can see all the history of chalk that's been written on this chalkboard from the beginning of time. That's not what it is. He takes our heart and makes an entirely new production. That's amazing. It's beautiful. It's miraculous. And I think, gosh, if this is what we get, why don't we run to God every chance we get? The Psalm 51 became so personal to me when I was in college. I think I was 22 years old, and my major at Texas A&M, thank you, was international studies. Part of my degree program required me to go into another country and study, either a study abroad or an internship. And so I had chosen to go to Lima, Peru, and had spent months preparing and creating this internship. I was really excited about it, never been to Peru at all. And as it happened, my parents were out of town, and so my sister was going to be coming to pick me up, but I was alone at my parents' house, packing my stuff, of course, the night before. I was supposed to leave for 3 months. I had just now started packing. And at some point in the evening, I'm like, I need to get my passport so that it's ready when I go to the airport tomorrow. I go to get my passport from the place that it usually was. Wasn't there. Okay, so I went and looked at my mom's desk, went through every file, went through every drawer. You guys, I took out my whole parents' house. I'm looking in like my dad's clothes drawers. I mean, everywhere in the house trying to find my passport. It's now very late at night. I'm supposed to be leaving the following morning, and I could not find my passport. So I had a moment of panic. I had a lot of moments of panic. But I had a thought in the process when I was looking, which was, maybe God doesn't even want me to go to Peru. Then I had a second thought, which was, I didn't even really pray about going to Peru, and maybe I'm not supposed to go. And then my next thought was, maybe God is punishing me because I didn't pray, and now I can't find my passport, and now I can't go to Peru. Well, it felt like a fork in the road. I could have taken an opportunity to turn to the Lord in dialogue and be like, I missed out on including you in this whole process. Let's do it together. Help me find my passport. But I didn't. Instead, I felt shame for not having done that previously. And I was like, you know what? It's too late now. I don't know if God wants me to go to Peru, but I'm going anyway, and I've got to figure this out. So I didn't have much of a conversation with God except to help me find my passport, which I didn't. Had to cancel my flight and fly to Houston the next day. My roommate in college lived in Houston, so she came to pick me up from the airport. However, on her way to the airport, she got in a car accident. And I thought, well, now not only is God punishing me, he's punishing my roommate, because now she's gotten to this awful car accident. Anyway, it was a blur of a day. I was able to get a new passport, got on the airplane 2 days later, and was on my way to Lima, Peru. For months, what I had planned for, which should have been a joyful, anticipatory event, I had a pit in my stomach when I sat on that airplane because I felt like I was disobeying God and he was punishing me, and I didn't really know what laid ahead of me in that summer. Well, the plane landed on the tarmac, and I got out, and this is where you get out and you have to walk on the tarmac to go up to the airport. And as I'm walking up to the airport, I see a whole crew of military people there in front of the entrance to the airport, standing outside on the tarmac. And I had traveled in other countries before, and I had seen, a military presence. But this was unlike anything I had ever seen. Ammunition, like guns towering high over their heads, all kinds of arsenal, this whole crew. And I was really fearful. And I thought, this is why God didn't want me to come. It's too dangerous here. There had been some terrorist activity a couple weeks before, and I thought, I just felt like I was walking into my doom and God's punishment. And then right before I walked into the airport, I look over at the military crew, and I realized that actually it was the janitorial crew coming to clean the airplane. And they had vacuums and brooms and hoses and buckets. It had nothing to do with the military. But I realized at the time is that I was looking through everything from a lens of shame in God's punishment towards me. And I realized then that if I had that lens through the rest of this summer, I was going to totally miss what God had for me. I got home that evening. I went to my host family's house, and the next morning I woke up and Psalm 51 became mine. I prayed through that. I wept over it because I realized this is just a few days' time where my heart had gotten so clouded I couldn't even see, and everything I viewed wasn't at all God's perspective. His delight was in me. He just wanted me to turn my heart towards him. And it was amazing that it was so quick. It didn't take some long thing that I had to do to get right back into this relationship with God. It was these verses of God creating in me this entirely new heart. And then I got to experience the whole rest of this summer of God's goodness. And I was there for a secular internship. And all kinds of people came to know Jesus that summer. And it was really, really powerful. So how do we live free from shame? This is one of the most important parts. Eradicating shame from our life is actually really not possible. The more we focus on shame, the more we feel shameful, that we're feeling shameful, that we're feeling shameful, and it creates a shame loop. What's more important is what we do with shame when we feel it. The separation, the difference between guilt and shame. Remember, guilt is wanting us to say, I'm sorry, and seek reconciliation and reconnection in relationship, where isolation moves us to a place alone. So number one, it's become aware of the story you're telling yourself and the role that shame is playing in this story. It's like the story I told you earlier about work and a relationship where it was getting so messy, and all I really wanted to do was run. But when I realized the story that I was telling myself and how shame was influencing it, and actually turned it around, and I heard God's version of the story, it brought total victory. Parents, Dee Bresman passed on a parenting tip to me that I have valued so much. And it's something that they did with their kids when they were young. Maybe they still do it, putting them to bed at night. She would ask her kids, is there anything that happened today that makes you feel kind of icky or bad? Because icky and bad feelings aren't from God. God wants to give you forgiveness and freedom in every situation. So let's talk about anything that you feel icky or bad about. Let's get it into the light so that Satan can't use it as a weapon of shame against your life. And it created a pattern of Dee and Dave connecting with their kids to bring things into the light. I love doing that with our kids, but even us as adults, that in every day we make it a regular practice of asking the Lord, are there things that feel icky and stuck on me that I want to bring into the light? Are there places where I've been hearing these lies that I'm not enough, that I don't have what it takes, or places of humiliation? And we get it out into the light, and we let God show us his truth. And then we shift our attention away from shame and back to the story that is true. The Psalms are full of David proclaiming God's truth and goodness of who he is. The New Testament, over and over and over again, we have the gospel of God bringing nothing into something, of God making